surrounded a passenger plane in midair. The pilots tried everything to escape, but the flock forced them into an emergency landing on the water. What rescuers later discovered in the cargo hold shocked the entire world. Subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable story, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Captain Marcus Hayden had spent more hours in the sky than he could count, and even after decades of flying, he still felt a strange sense of reverence each time the plane lifted away from the ground. This morning was no different. The rising sun painted the horizon with gentle strokes of amber and pale gold, and the clear sky stretched endlessly ahead of him. The engines hummed with a steady rhythm, vibrating beneath his hands as he guided the aircraft along its designated course. There was a calmness in the air, the sort of serenity every pilot secretly prayed for. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features softened by the quiet dignity in his eyes. His dark skin bore the marks of time and responsibility, and his graying hair was cropped short under his neatly fitted captain's hat. To many, he was a symbol of discipline and poise. To his colleagues, he was a living legend. He had grown up in one of the rougher neighborhoods of Atlanta, where most boys his age had no dreams beyond survival. Yet, from the moment he saw his first plane soaring above the cracked basketball courts of his childhood, he knew he belonged in the sky. That sense of destiny had carried him through years of struggle, through rigorous training, through the moments when giving up would have been easier than pressing on. Now, seated in the cockpit of a commercial airliner, he felt he had earned his place among the clouds. Beside him sat Daniel, his young co-pilot, a man barely 30 with bright eyes and an energy that Marcus sometimes found exhausting. Daniel had ambition but lacked patience. He often believed he knew more than he did. Still, Marcus saw potential in him. This flight was another opportunity to teach Daniel what could not be found in manuals: composure. Daniel tapped his pen against the clipboard as he double-checked their instruments for the third time in 10 minutes, and Marcus allowed himself a faint smile. Behind them in the cabin, life carried on as it usually did during long-haul flights. A family with a small child occupied the front row, the little girl pressing her nose against the window to marvel at the sea of clouds. A group of tourists farther back spoke loudly, their laughter echoing down the aisle. A frail, elderly couple sat quietly with their hands entwined, whispering to each other as though sharing secrets only they understood. The cabin crew moved gracefully between rows, offering drinks, smiles, and reassurance to anyone who needed it. But Marcus's eyes lingered on the manifest earlier that morning. There had been a note, an almost casual mention of heavy cargo loaded into the baggage hold. Several large crates had been stored just before takeoff, their contents vaguely marked and declared by paperwork that seemed, at a glance, in order. It was not unusual for cargo of all kinds to be carried alongside passengers, and yet something about those crates troubled him. He remembered the way one of the handlers had struggled under their weight, grunting as if moving stone. And he remembered, too, the solitary passenger who had checked them in, a man with a shadowed expression and eyes that never seemed to rest on one thing for long. The stranger had boarded quietly, keeping to himself, his coat collar raised despite the warmth of the terminal. Marcus had filed it away as one of those countless details a captain notices but has no cause to question. Still, he felt the faint stirrings of unease. The steady routine of the flight lulled most of the passengers into comfort. Drinks were poured, trays of meals distributed, seatbelt signs clicked off. Marcus allowed himself a moment to lean back, his fingers still close to the controls, and looked out at the expanse ahead. Clear skies, gentle winds. Nothing unusual to report. He thought of his son back home, a boy of 16 who dreamed of becoming a pilot just like his father. Marcus had promised him a trip to the simulator next weekend, and the thought warmed him. Flying was not just his profession, it was a legacy he longed to pass on. As he adjusted a dial, Daniel glanced at him. "Textbook day, Captain," the young co-pilot said with a grin. Marcus gave a single nod. "Yes, textbook." He kept his tone measured, as he always did, because Marcus Hayden believed in never tempting fate with careless words. He knew that the skies could change in an instant, that serenity was fragile, and though the day appeared ordinary, he felt a strange pull in his gut. A warning without substance, a whisper without voice. In the cabin, the child pressed her palms against the window and gasped at the sunlight shimmering across the clouds. Her laughter rang out, pure and light, and it eased the nerves of those around her. The tourists raised their cameras to snap photos, capturing what they thought would be just another memory of another routine journey. The elderly couple closed their eyes and leaned into one another, as though the gentle hum of the engines was a lullaby written for them alone. To the untrained eye, everything was perfect. Marcus checked the readings again. Altitude steady, airspeed consistent. The radio crackled with the familiar voices of air traffic controllers, calm and efficient. He responded in his usual firm manner, marking their position, acknowledging the path ahead. The world seemed to stretch without end, and for a while, Marcus allowed himself to believe that this flight would be like every other. Peaceful, unremarkable, forgettable by the time they landed. Yet, beneath the hum of engines and the calm chatter of passengers, a thread of tension tightened. Somewhere, far ahead, on the horizon too faint for human eyes, dark shapes were gathering. They were still only specks in the distance, invisible to those on board. But soon, the serenity of this calm flight would fracture, and Marcus Hayden's skill, courage, and very soul would be tested in ways he had never imagined. For now, though, the captain sat steady at the helm, unaware that the most extraordinary and perilous chapter of his career was already beginning to unfold. For nearly an hour, the flight remained smooth and predictable, the kind of journey that reassured passengers and allowed a captain to relax into routine. Marcus kept his eyes on the endless blue horizon, fingers resting lightly on the controls, the hum of the engines blending with the rhythmic clicking of Daniel's pen as the young co-pilot noted their position on his clipboard. The sky seemed vast and empty, a safe corridor carved between continents, and Marcus found himself lulled by its deceptive peace. Yet the unease he had felt earlier had not completely left him. It was a quiet prickle at the base of his neck, the kind that every seasoned pilot learns not to ignore. He had flown through storms and turbulence, guided passengers safely through lightning and sudden wind shears, but what unsettled him now was the absence of any visible danger. The air was calm, the weather reports pristine, and still his instincts whispered of something approaching. It began subtly, with a change in the light outside the cockpit. The sun was still high, but Marcus noticed the way its rays dimmed slightly, as though a veil had been drawn across part of the sky. At first, he dismissed it as a patch of thin cloud. When he leaned forward to peer through the glass, however, he noticed small specks on the distant horizon. They were too numerous to be aircraft, too scattered to be debris. He narrowed his eyes. Daniel followed his gaze, leaning toward the windshield. "What is that?" he asked, the usual confidence in his voice replaced by hesitation. Marcus did not answer immediately. He adjusted the instruments, checked for traffic alerts, and found nothing unusual. The radar showed clear airspace ahead, yet his eyes told him otherwise. The specks multiplied as they drew nearer, shifting like smoke but sharper, more defined. He thought of birds, perhaps a migrating flock, though the numbers seemed far too great. He had seen geese in formation, gulls wheeling over coastlines, even the occasional eagle riding thermals, but never this many, never in such a concentrated direction toward an aircraft. By the time 10 minutes had passed, the shapes were unmistakable. They were birds, hundreds of them, maybe more, sweeping across the horizon in patterns that defied ordinary flock behavior. Instead of dispersing at the approach of the jet, they seemed to angle deliberately toward it. Marcus's grip tightened on the controls. Daniel muttered something under his breath, his pen forgotten. In the cabin, the first passengers began to notice. A woman by the window frowned, leaning closer to the glass. Her gasp drew the attention of her seatmate, and soon heads turned along the row. Fingers pointed, whispers spread, and within moments several people were craning their necks to see. The little girl in the front row giggled at first, marveling at the sudden appearance of so many wings glittering in the sunlight. Her laughter was quickly smothered when she sensed the unease of the adults around her. The elderly couple exchanged worried looks, their fingers tightening as they turned toward the window. The cabin crew, trained to mask their emotions, forced smiles as they moved between rows, though their eyes betrayed confusion. Marcus heard the change in the cabin before he saw it on the monitors. The rise in voices, the murmur of unease, the ripple of fear spreading through the passengers. He pressed the intercom button, his voice calm and firm as he reassured them that everything was under control. Yet, even as he spoke, he could see the truth of the matter. The birds were not scattering as they should have. They moved with unnatural determination, their wings beating in unison as though guided by some shared intent. He adjusted the course slightly, banking the plane just a few degrees to the north. Normally, such a maneuver would have been enough to veer around a flock, but to his disquiet, the birds shifted with them, bending their formation to intercept the jet. It was as if the flock itself had intelligence, as though it anticipated his every move. Daniel's face paled. "They're following us," he whispered, almost unwilling to admit it. Marcus did not respond. His mind worked quickly, calculating possibilities, weighing risks. He had faced engine failures, electrical malfunctions, even near collisions in storm-choked skies. But never had he encountered a living obstacle that refused to yield. The radio crackled with the distant voices of controllers, oblivious to what was unfolding thousands of feet above the earth. He considered calling it in, yet part of him hesitated. What could he say? That the plane was being shadowed by a legion of birds moving like soldiers under command. He needed more than words to explain this. Outside the cockpit, the sky grew darker. It was not the sun, but the sheer density of wings that dimmed the light. Shadows rippled over the fuselage, sweeping across the windows like storm clouds. The sound began then, faint at first but growing steadily, the rush of beating wings, a chorus that throbbed against the steady drone of the engines. It was a sound that reached into the bones, primal and unsettling, reminding every soul aboard of the fragility of metal against nature's fury. Panic in the cabin escalated. Some passengers pressed the call buttons frantically, demanding explanations from the crew. Others clutched armrests with white knuckles, their eyes fixed on the writhing mass outside. A man pulled out his phone and began recording, muttering disbelief as he filmed. The child, who had giggled before, now cried softly, hiding her face against her mother's chest. Even the tourists, once so loud, had fallen silent, their laughter gone, replaced by wide-eyed dread. Marcus spoke again over the intercom, his voice a deliberate anchor of calm. He told them it was nothing to fear, that the situation was under control, that everything was being handled with professionalism. But the words felt thin even to him. The truth pressed heavy in his chest. This was no ordinary encounter. Birds were creatures of instinct, yet these moved as though driven by something far beyond instinct. They hemmed the plane in, darting ahead to block, wheeling back to circle, closing in from every angle. Daniel glanced at him, his voice barely steady. "What do we do if they don't break off?" Marcus stared ahead, his jaw tight. The question had no easy answer. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of genuine fear, not for himself, but for the lives entrusted to his hands. He had promised them safety when they boarded his plane, and now the sky itself seemed determined to betray that promise. The hours of calm flight were over. The serenity of the journey had been shattered. The passengers, the crew, and even the captain himself knew they were witnessing something unnatural, something that could not be explained by weather charts or flight manuals. And though the engines still roared faithfully, carrying them forward through the thickening storm of wings, Marcus Hayden understood with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The flock pressed closer, thousands of bodies moving as one, and the sky darkened further still. The transition from peace to peril was complete, and the captain braced himself for whatever awaited in the moments ahead, knowing that the true test of his skill and his courage was about to begin. The silence that had once been a companion in the cockpit was gone, replaced by a relentless drumming against the glass and metal skin of the aircraft. At first, it had been faint, almost like heavy rain pattering across the fuselage, but as the minutes passed, the sound grew in intensity until it felt as though the entire plane was caught in a storm made not of water, but of wings. The birds were no longer distant shadows on the horizon. They were here, surrounding the jet in a swarm so vast that it seemed the sky itself had turned alive and hostile. Their bodies struck the windshield with hollow thuds, feathers streaked across the cockpit windows, and sharp beaks clattered against the glass as though testing its strength. Marcus tightened his grip on the yoke, his knuckles whitening, and forced himself to remain calm even as his heart pounded harder than he wished to admit. Daniel's breathing was audible now, uneven and shallow. The young co-pilot stared wide-eyed at the sea of wings beyond the glass, his hands trembling on the controls he had all but surrendered to Marcus. "This isn't normal," he muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. Marcus did not look at him. He couldn't afford to. His entire focus was on keeping the plane steady as the swarm buffeted it from all sides. The altimeter dipped, then corrected. The engines strained against the resistance, their steady roar fighting to dominate the deafening cacophony of wings. In the cabin, panic surged like a rising tide. The passengers, who had been murmuring nervously before, now screamed openly. The young girl in the front row sobbed uncontrollably in her mother's arms, while the elderly couple clutched each other, their whispered prayers drowned out by the chaos around them. A man shouted that they were doomed. Another tried to push his way toward the emergency exits, and the cabin crew fought desperately to maintain order, their rehearsed smiles long gone. Overhead, bins rattled with each jolt of turbulence caused by the colliding birds. Feathers swirled past the windows, carried on the slipstream, blotting out the sun until the interior of the plane seemed cloaked in unnatural twilight. Marcus tried a controlled descent, easing the nose of the aircraft downward in hopes of finding a pocket of clear air below the swarm. For a brief moment, the tactic seemed to work. The density of birds lessened, the pounding against the fuselage dimmed. But within seconds, as if sensing his maneuver, the flock shifted with him, diving in unison to meet the aircraft once more. Daniel swore under his breath. "They're following us, Captain. They're actually following us." Marcus ignored the panic in his voice. He adjusted course sharply to the east, but again the birds mirrored him, curving in the same direction like a living tide determined to hem them in. The first real blow came when a large bird slammed directly into the starboard engine. There was a sickening crunch, followed by a thunderous explosion that shook the plane from nose to tail. A flash of fire burst from the turbine before it sputtered and died, the roar replaced by an awful silence on that side of the aircraft. Alarms screamed in the cockpit, red lights flashing across the control panel. Marcus's training took over. He cut fuel to the damaged engine, closed the fire shutoff valve, and worked quickly to stabilize the plane on the remaining engine. He spoke firmly into the radio, declaring an emergency, his voice measured even as adrenaline surged through his veins. In the cabin, the explosion had set off pandemonium. The entire plane lurched violently, sending drinks, phones, and bags tumbling into the aisle. Passengers shrieked, some praying, others cursing, their fear raw and unfiltered. The cabin crew shouted for them to remain seated, to keep their belts fastened, but few listened. One man tried to unbuckle and run toward the cockpit, only to be restrained by a stewardess whose face was pale with terror yet unyielding with duty. Daniel leaned closer to Marcus, his voice trembling. "One engine down, Captain. What if the other one—" He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Both men knew what would happen if the second engine failed. Marcus fixed him with a hard glance, the kind that commanded silence. "Focus," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "We still have one engine. We make it count." But even as he said it, the threat loomed heavily in his mind. The birds were relentless, striking again and again, battering the remaining engine with suicidal determination. It was as though they had no fear of death, no instinct to preserve themselves. Marcus had seen flocks scatter at the approach of aircraft before, their survival instincts overriding curiosity or aggression. But this was something else entirely. It was organized, purposeful, a siege rather than a coincidence. The noise inside the cockpit grew unbearable. The drumming of wings, the cries of panicked passengers bleeding through the cabin door, the insistent alarms from the disabled engine, it all blended into a single, overwhelming roar. Marcus forced himself to breathe evenly, to think clearly. His mind ran through options, each bleaker than the last. The nearest airport was too far for a one-engine climb with a hostile swarm still pressing them downward. He considered altitude, considered speed, considered fuel. Nothing provided a clear solution. The plane jolted again as another bird struck the nose cone. The windshield cracked with a spiderweb fracture across Daniel's side, though the reinforced glass held. Daniel flinched away instinctively, his hands raised as though to shield himself. Marcus gritted his teeth, steadying the controls. He could feel the tremor of fear radiating from his co-pilot, but there was no room for hesitation now. Every second mattered. In the cabin, the young girl's cries turned into terrified screams as the plane shuddered. Her mother whispered frantic reassurances, though her own eyes brimmed with tears. The elderly couple held on as if to each other's very souls, their lips moving in constant prayer. The tourists who had once laughed now sat rigid, their cameras forgotten, their gazes fixed on the swarming darkness outside. For every passenger, the realization dawned. They were not simply flying through a dangerous flock, they were under attack. Marcus steadied the yoke, forcing the plane into as level a trajectory as possible with only one engine carrying its weight. He spoke into the intercom again, his tone unwavering, though his words betrayed the gravity of the moment. He told the passengers to prepare for turbulence, to trust the crew, to remain calm. But even as the words left his lips, he knew they rang hollow against the chaos that surrounded them. The birds pressed closer, their black shapes slamming against the fuselage like hailstones from some vengeful sky. Feathers clogged vents, bodies tumbled across the wings, and still more came, an endless tide replacing every one that fell. It was a battle of endurance, machine against nature, and Marcus knew the machine could not withstand it forever. With the starboard engine gone and the port engine threatened, the captain's mind turned to the unthinkable. He had always known that one day he might be called to make a choice no pilot wished to face, where and how to bring a crippled plane down with lives depending on him. He had trained for it, studied scenarios, prepared himself in theory, but nothing in the manuals had ever envisioned this, an intelligent, relentless assault by thousands of creatures as if the very sky had turned traitor. As Marcus adjusted his grip and steadied his nerves, the truth crystallized within him. This was no ordinary emergency. This was war, and his aircraft was the battlefield. The plane trembled as if it were alive, a wounded creature struggling against an enemy that refused to relent. Marcus held the yoke steady, his muscles taut, his heartbeat thrumming in his ears louder than the alarms that still screamed from the console. The loss of the starboard engine had crippled their strength, leaving them limping through the air with only one heart still beating within the vast body of metal and wires. Every second that passed, he expected the remaining engine to falter under the relentless onslaught, to choke on feathers or debris and leave them utterly powerless. The knowledge pressed against his mind like a heavy stone, yet he forced his breathing to remain calm, his hands precise. He could not show fear. Not now. Daniel's voice broke the oppressive roar inside the cockpit. "We're losing altitude faster than we can stabilize," he said, his words tumbling out in ragged breaths. His youthful face, usually bright with eagerness, was pale with dread. "If the other engine fails—" He stopped himself, unwilling to finish the thought. Marcus's eyes flicked toward him for a fraction of a second, a look that was as much command as reassurance. "We do not think of failure," Marcus said evenly. "We think of survival. Keep your focus." But even as he spoke, his mind was already racing ahead. The nearest airport was impossibly distant. The math did not lie. On one engine, with the drag of a hostile flock battering them from all sides, they would never make it. The alternative spread beneath them in endless, glittering blue, the ocean, cold, merciless, and vast. To set a jetliner upon its surface was a maneuver reserved for nightmares, a desperate gamble most pilots hoped they would never face. Yet Marcus knew the choice had already been made for him. He would have to bring the plane down upon the sea. The intercom crackled beneath his hand as he pressed the switch, his voice resonating through the cabin. He explained with firm simplicity what was happening. They had lost one engine, they were experiencing difficulties, and preparations for an emergency landing were being made. He told them to remain seated, to listen carefully to the crew's instructions, and above all to remain calm. His words carried a weight that belied the storm outside, and though panic still writhed through the cabin, the steadiness of his tone anchored them, if only barely. In the rows behind, the passengers clutched at each other. The little girl buried her face against her mother's chest, muffling sobs that rattled through her small frame. The elderly couple held hands tighter than they had in years, whispering prayers that mingled with the gasps and cries of others. The tourists who had been so loud earlier now sat frozen, their cameras forgotten at their sides. For every passenger, time seemed to slow into a terrible clarity, each second a bead of anticipation strung upon a fragile thread of hope. The cabin crew moved with remarkable discipline, their training carrying them through even as their eyes betrayed fear. They demonstrated brace positions, distributed life vests, and repeated instructions over the din of wails and shouts. One stewardess, her voice trembling but determined, knelt beside the panicking man who had tried earlier to force his way toward the exits. She held his gaze, spoke with quiet authority, and at last he slumped back into his seat, defeated by the inevitability pressing in from every direction. Outside, the birds still wheeled and struck, as though determined to drive the jet from the sky. Marcus guided the descent with meticulous calculation, balancing speed with angle, fighting the plane's natural resistance against such a maneuver. The altimeter wound downward with merciless speed. At intervals, he feathered the remaining engine, coaxing it, praying silently to the machine that had never failed him before. Daniel's voice wavered. "We'll hit the water too hard at this rate." Marcus did not look at him, his eyes locked on the horizon. "Then we change the rate," he answered, and his hands moved with the precision of decades. He eased the nose, adjusted the flaps, and fought against the unyielding drag of the birds battering them like a living storm. The ocean rose up to meet them, its surface glittering deceptively calm, an endless sheet of blue glass. Marcus's mind fractured into two selves, one that saw the raw, terrifying enormity of what was coming, and another that acted purely by instinct and training, commanding his body with absolute precision. He thought of his son, waiting at home, dreaming of the skies. He thought of the passengers behind him, each one trusting him with their fragile lives. He thought of the oath he had made to himself as a boy staring up from cracked asphalt streets, never to falter, never to give up. The final seconds stretched into an eternity. The wings skimmed the air with fragile grace, the fuselage quivered with strain. The ocean swelled larger and larger until it filled every window. Marcus pulled the yoke gently, calculating the perfect balance between lift and drag, the narrow margin that would determine survival or catastrophe. The plane shuddered as though in agony, its frame groaning against the unnatural angle. The remaining engine screamed with exertion, a desperate cry that echoed the collective breath of every soul on board. Then came the impact. It was not a crash, but a violent embrace, metal meeting water with a force that sent shock waves through the entire structure. The nose dipped, then lifted as Marcus wrestled at level, the fuselage skimming the surface before settling with a thunderous splash that sent walls of spray towering into the air. Inside, passengers were thrown forward, screams colliding with the grinding roar of metal and water. Overhead, bins burst open, luggage spilled, oxygen masks shook from their housings, though none deployed. For a heartbeat it seemed the plane might split apart, but Marcus held firm, guiding the crippled craft as though coaxing it into sleep. Silence followed. Silence, broken only by the groan of metal and the ragged sobs of those who realized they were still alive. The plane floated, battered but intact, upon the endless expanse of sea. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. Already, outside, the birds circled. Their cries pierced the air, shrill and furious. When the first passengers moved to the emergency exits, flinging them open to escape, the flock descended. Wings beat against the opening, Talons clawed at outstretched hands, beaks snapped at the bright orange of life vests. Panic surged anew as people stumbled back, screaming, clutching at wounds. The only safety seemed to be beneath the water, where those who leapt and dove could escape the fury of the sky, surfacing gasping and wide-eyed some distance away. Marcus remained in the cockpit, his chest heaving, his hands still locked upon the controls, though their task was done. He heard the chaos behind him, the cries of passengers and the shouts of crew, and he closed his eyes for a moment. He had brought them down alive, but the battle was far from over. The birds were not finished. Whatever had driven them to attack remained unresolved, and now, as the crippled jet floated vulnerable upon the sea, he knew the next stage of their ordeal was only beginning. The plane drifted on the restless surface of the sea, its once proud frame battered and humbled, but still miraculously afloat. The immediate terror of impact had passed, yet the atmosphere inside remained thick with dread. Passengers sobbed, clung to one another, or sat in stunned silence, unable to process the enormity of what had just transpired. Some stared out of the windows, their faces pale in the dim light filtering through the feather-choked sky, and saw the silhouettes of the birds circling relentlessly above. It was as though the flock, having succeeded in driving the aircraft from the heavens, now lingered to ensure that it never returned. Marcus unbuckled himself from the captain's chair for the first time since the crisis began. His body ached from the tension he had held in every muscle, yet his mind remained focused, sharp with the awareness that their danger was far from over. Daniel slumped beside him, his forehead beaded with sweat, his hands trembling as he wiped them against his uniform. The younger man's eyes were haunted, filled with the unmistakable shadow of someone who had come face to face with mortality. "We're alive," Daniel whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it true. Marcus gave a short nod. For now. He stepped into the cabin, greeted by a wave of desperation. The crew struggled to maintain order, shouting over the din of frightened voices, trying to keep passengers from rushing the emergency exits. Several had already attempted to escape into the open sea, only to be forced back by the furious onslaught of talons and beaks. A man nursed a bleeding arm where a bird had clawed him, while another sobbed as his life vest was torn away before he could leap into the water. The realization spread quickly. The sky itself was a prison, and the birds were its wardens. Marcus's sharp eyes caught something that others had missed. The birds were not attacking at random. They clustered in greatest number around the rear of the fuselage, wheeling and diving with almost obsessive intensity near the cargo hold. Their cries seemed louder there, more insistent, as though they were being drawn to something hidden within the belly of the plane. The captain felt the prickling unease return, sharper now, more pointed. He had dismissed it earlier as instinct, but now it felt like knowledge. Whatever was inside those crates, it was the reason for this nightmare. He pushed past frightened passengers, ignoring the grasping hands that reached for him, and sought out the chief stewardess. Her face was pale, streaked with tears she had tried to hide, but she stood her ground, holding order as best she could. "Captain," she said, her voice hoarse, "the passengers are panicking. We need rescue. We need—" Marcus raised a hand, silencing her. "Rescue is coming. We radioed our position before we went down. But tell me this, did you see what was loaded in the cargo hold before departure?" The stewardess hesitated. "Only large crates, wooden, heavy. The handlers said they were declared properly." Her uncertainty was plain, and Marcus felt the knot tighten in his chest. He remembered the man in the coat, the way he had avoided eye contact, the faint scent of secrecy about him. Contraband, Marcus thought. Something alive, something that did not belong here. The plane groaned, shifting with the swell of the waves. From outside came another chorus of cries, sharp and angry. The passengers shrank back from the windows as the birds swept low, their wings battering the glass. Marcus moved forward, steadied himself against a seat, and turned to address the cabin. His voice, though quiet, carried the authority of command. "Stay seated. Do not open the exits. Help will come. We must keep calm until then." His words did little to ease the tension, but they offered a thread for people to cling to, and in that moment it was enough. Time crawled. Minutes stretched into an hour, and at last the distant hum of engines signaled approaching vessels. The Coast Guard had arrived. Relief surged through the passengers as they spotted the shapes of small boats cresting the waves, growing larger as they drew near. But even before they could rejoice, the birds reacted. Their formation shifted, diving lower, more aggressive, as if determined to guard their prize. The rescuers slowed their approach, cautious under the sudden storm of wings. Marcus leaned against the cabin wall, watching the chaos outside with grim understanding. The birds were not merely attacking. They were defending. And what they defended lay in the cargo hold of his aircraft. The rescuers eventually drew close enough to toss lines across the water. Crew members ushered passengers forward in groups, helping them climb into waiting boats. It was a perilous process, the birds swooping to strike at any who lingered too long in the open. Yet, one by one, people were evacuated, screaming, sobbing, but alive. Marcus refused to leave the plane. He remained with a handful of crew, his gaze fixed on the rear where the noise of the birds grew almost unbearable. From within the cargo hold came another sound, faint but unmistakable. Scratching, flapping, the muffled cries of something alive. Marcus turned his head sharply, listening, his suspicions confirmed. The crates were not mere cargo, they were cages. Daniel approached him, his expression ashen. "Captain, did you hear that?" His voice trembled with both fear and awe. Marcus nodded slowly. "I heard." For a long moment they stood in silence, the truth dawning heavy upon them. The birds outside were not attackers without cause. They were drawn here, compelled by the cries of their imprisoned kin. By the time the last of the passengers had been ferried away, the captain's conviction was unshakable. Whatever nightmare had driven the flock to assault them had been orchestrated by human greed, not natural fury. He looked once more toward the rear of the fuselage, where the cargo hold waited like a sealed tomb. He did not need to open it now to know what lay within. The cries of the trapped were answer enough, and the fury of their free brethren painted the sky with proof. As the rescue boat circled, awaiting final clearance to tow the battered aircraft toward shore, Marcus remained standing tall in the aisle, his hands clenched, his heart heavy with the knowledge that their ordeal was not yet over. Soon the truth would be laid bare. Soon the secret of the cargo hold would emerge into the light. The battered aircraft, bobbing like an exhausted leviathan upon the restless sea, finally began its slow journey toward the shore. Lines had been fastened to its frame by the rescuers, their small boats pulling cautiously while the circling flock continued to trail close overhead. The birds never strayed far, keeping a watchful distance but shrieking their cries whenever one of the vessels neared the rear of the fuselage. Marcus stood by the cockpit windows, watching their movements, every instinct telling him that the secret within the cargo hold was the root of all that had unfolded. The cries from inside the belly of the plane grew louder as the hours passed, faint though muffled, yet undeniable to ears that were straining for clarity. On deck, the rescuers exchanged wary glances, muttering to one another about the strange behavior of the birds. Some pointed to the sky with incredulous faces, marveling at how tightly the flock clung to the drifting wreck. They had all seen birds scatter from danger before, but never had they seen them guard something with such focus. Never had they seen them display such apparent intent. When one sailor suggested cutting open the cargo bay at sea, his superior shook his head firmly. The birds had already attacked men who ventured too close. If they pried into the hold now, they might provoke an assault too fierce to withstand. Better to wait until land, where more hands and heavier equipment could offer protection. The passengers, now huddled in safety aboard the rescue boats, were too shaken to argue. They were alive, and that was enough. But their eyes still widened in fear when the flock passed overhead and whispers circulated among them about what they had heard within the cargo bay, those strange, sorrowful cries that had carried through the metal walls of the aircraft. Some spoke of cursed cargo, of spirits or omens, while others, more rational, suspected something living, smuggled where it had no right to be. Marcus, however, needed no speculation. In his heart, he already knew the truth. The image of the man in the coat haunted him, the way he had slunk through boarding with his eyes fixed on the floor, the way he had watched those crates as though his very life depended upon them. Marcus had flown many flights carrying all manner of cargo, but this was different. This was alive, and it was calling to its kin in a voice more powerful than any human law. The journey to shore took longer than any of them wished, every swell of the ocean tugging at the wounded aircraft like a predator testing its prey. The sun was low by the time the coastline came into view, and with its appearance came a ripple of hope. Yet, even as the harbor lights glittered ahead, the birds did not retreat. They followed, relentless, a black ribbon unraveling across the sky. Their cries carried over the waves, so constant that the men on the towboats pressed cloth to their ears to dull the sound. When, at last, the plane was hauled into the shallows and tethered at the dock, a unit of uniformed officials awaited them. Police, customs officers, and a handful of men in plain clothes stood with arms crossed, their faces grim. They had been briefed on the emergency, on the loss of an engine and the miraculous water landing, but their eyes were drawn almost at once to the sky where the flock wheeled overhead. Even from shore, the phenomenon was undeniable. The birds were not dispersing. They were guarding. Marcus was among the first to step onto solid ground, his boots heavy with seawater, his uniform clinging damply to his frame. He straightened to his full height despite the exhaustion in his bones. When the lead officer approached, notebook in hand, Marcus wasted no time. "It's in the cargo hold," he said simply, his voice hoarse but steady. "Whatever those birds want, whatever's drawn them here, it's in those crates." The officer studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. Orders were barked. Men hurried aboard, and a team equipped with crowbars and cutting torches made their way to the rear of the plane. The flock above screamed louder, circling tighter as if aware that the moment of revelation had arrived. Inside the cargo bay, the smell hit them first. A thick, musky stench of feathers and sweat, tinged with the acrid odor of sedatives and decay. The men exchanged uneasy looks as they moved closer to the stacked wooden crates, each one marked with false labels declaring them as machinery, but the muffled sounds left no room for doubt. Something inside shifted, claws scraping against wood, wings beating weakly in confinement. One crate rocked slightly, and from within came a pitiful cry that pierced the air with heartbreaking clarity. When the first crate was pried open, the truth spilled into the dim light. A mass of feathers, eyes dull yet burning with desperation, filled the space within. Exotic birds, their plumage a riot of brilliant colors dulled by filth and confinement, lay huddled together. Some flapped weakly, too drugged to rise. Others lifted their heads and cried in voices that echoed out of the bay and into the sky. The sound electrified the flock outside, which answered in a deafening chorus, their cries now triumphant, furious, and unrelenting. The men recoiled in shock. Several cursed under their breath, others stared in disbelief. More crates were opened, each revealing the same. Rare birds, species worth fortunes on the black market, jammed into spaces too small to contain them, many half dead from neglect. Some had suffocated, their lifeless bodies pressed against their living companions, and the sight drew gasps of revulsion even from hardened officials. Marcus stood in the doorway of the bay, his jaw tight, his chest heavy with fury. He had seen much in his years as a pilot, but never such cruelty. And in that moment he understood the purpose of the flock's relentless assault. They had not sought vengeance. They had sought rescue. Their kin had called to them through the darkness of wood and steel, and they had answered with the only power they possessed, sheer numbers and unyielding devotion. The man in the coat was dragged forward from among the passengers who had been held aside. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes flickered with something between defiance and fear as the officers pressed him against the side of the dock. Questions were hurled at him, demands for explanation, but he gave none. He kept his mouth shut, jaw locked, his silence only deepening the hatred in the eyes of those who had witnessed the suffering he had caused. The officials did not need his words. The evidence was clear. These were creatures smuggled for profit, torn from jungles and forests to be sold as trophies to the wealthy. The man's past crimes had already marked him, but this was unforgivable. Above, the flock wheeled lower as though awaiting the liberation of their kin. When one of the cages was carried from the hold and set upon the dock, the birds erupted in cries that shook the air. They hovered close, wings flashing, eyes bright with something that seemed more than instinct. Marcus watched, awestruck, as the free birds formed a protective circle overhead, their flight precise, unified, almost ceremonial. The authorities began the grim work of cataloging the cargo, counting the living and the dead, and arranging for the survivors to be taken to sanctuaries. Every opened crate revealed new horror, but also new life clinging stubbornly to existence. Some of the crew wept openly at the sight, while others turned away, unable to stomach the cruelty laid bare before them. Through it all, Marcus remained silent, his gaze fixed on the sky and the extraordinary display of loyalty unfolding above. He felt a weight in his chest that was more than anger, more than sorrow. It was awe. He had witnessed the miracle of flight his whole life, but never had he seen it wielded with such purpose, such unity, such unbreakable resolve. The birds had accomplished what no human army could have done. They had brought an airliner from the sky to save their own. As the last crate was pried open and its broken occupants revealed, Marcus closed his eyes briefly and exhaled. The truth was out. The veil had been lifted, and the world would now see what greed had wrought and what loyalty had overcome. And yet, he knew this was not the end. The consequences would ripple far beyond this dock, beyond this night. Laws would be tested, markets disrupted, consciences shaken. The man in the coat would face justice, but the greater judgment had already been rendered by the natural world itself. Humanity had been reminded of a truth it had long forgotten, that the bonds of life extended beyond species, and that the call of freedom was strong enough to shake even the steel of the skies. The revelations at the dock reverberated like thunder far beyond the harbor. Word of the discovery spread quickly, carried first by the officers who had witnessed it, then by the reporters who had descended like gulls upon the scene. The story raced through news wires and television channels, reaching living rooms, boardrooms, and classrooms across the world. Images of exhausted, half-dead birds being lifted gently from their crates seared themselves into the conscience of the public. The footage of the circling flock overhead, thousands of wings blackening the twilight sky, played endlessly, each repetition underscoring the miracle of devotion that had driven them to bring a jetliner down from the heavens. The nation was shaken, and soon the entire globe watched in awe and horror. Marcus found himself pulled into the whirlwind whether he wished it or not. In the hours after the unveiling, officials had ushered him into interviews, debriefings, and questioning. He told his story calmly, precisely, leaving nothing out. He spoke of the moment the first birds appeared, of their unnatural unity, of the way they had mirrored every maneuver of the plane until one engine was lost. He described the panic of the passengers, the chaos of the cabin, and finally the impossible decision to set the aircraft down upon the open sea. His voice never rose, never faltered. Yet those who heard him felt the weight of every word, for it carried the gravitas of a man who had faced death and seen the line between human power and natural force erased. The authorities wasted little time in parading the captured smuggler before the cameras. Shackled, silent, his eyes downcast, he was led away under heavy guard, his refusal to answer questions painting him as the villain he was. The world did not need his confession. The evidence had already condemned him. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, forgotten by the masses except as the man whose greed nearly cost hundreds of innocent lives and brought shame upon human conscience. For Marcus, though, the man was almost irrelevant. The true lesson lay not in his crime, but in the extraordinary response of the creatures he had sought to exploit. As the days unfolded, the rescued birds were transported to sanctuaries, wildlife reserves, and aviaries that could provide the care they desperately needed. Veterinarians worked tirelessly, some shaking their heads at the damage inflicted, others marveling at the resilience of the survivors. The sight of brilliant plumage slowly regaining its sheen became a symbol of hope. Children sent letters and drawings to the sanctuaries, scrawled images of colorful wings and heartfelt wishes for recovery. Activist groups seized the moment to demand stricter laws against trafficking, pointing to the tragedy as undeniable proof of humanity's arrogance. Politicians, never blind to the direction of public sentiment, began to speak of reforms and harsher penalties for poaching. For a brief time, it seemed as though the world might change. But amid the speeches and headlines, Marcus kept his thoughts quieter, closer to his chest. He attended ceremonies where he was called a hero, applauded by crowds and praised by officials who stood in suits beneath the same skies he had once commanded from the cockpit. Reporters thrust microphones toward him, asking how it felt to have saved so many lives, what went through his mind as the plane touched the sea, what he thought of the birds that had forced his hand. He answered with dignity, speaking of the passengers and crew, of teamwork, of calm under pressure. He accepted the title of hero with the same composure he had accepted every challenge in his life. Yet, deep down, he knew that the honor belonged as much to the flock as to himself. Without their intervention, the cries from the cargo hold would have gone unheard. Without their determination, The cruelty hidden in those crates would have vanished into silence. In the quiet of his home, away from cameras and ceremony, Marcus reflected on what he had seen. The image of thousands of wings, moving as one with purpose and conviction, haunted his dreams. He would wake at night hearing the echo of their cries, half warning, half plea, reverberating through the darkness. He thought of how close death had come, how easily the sea could have claimed them all. Yet, what lingered most was not the fear, but the awe. The birds had acted with a unity no human force could have orchestrated. They had risked their lives, hurling themselves against steel and fire for the chance to free their imprisoned kin. He recalled his son's voice the night he returned home, trembling with questions, wide-eyed with wonder. Did they really save each other, Dad? Did the birds really bring your plane down so they could help? Marcus had knelt, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, and told him the truth. Yes, they had. It was not instinct alone. It was loyalty, courage, and something greater than humans often gave animals credit for. The boy's eyes had glowed with reverence, and Marcus felt a surge of hope that the next generation might see the natural world with more humility than his own. Weeks passed, and the incident remained a topic of fascination. Scholars debated whether the flock's actions were coordinated instinct, collective intelligence, or something bordering on the inexplicable. Scientists studied the recordings, pointing to patterns in their flight, while philosophers spoke of moral lessons, of the kinship between beings that humans too often denied. Marcus listened when asked, but he did not need theories. He had seen enough with his own eyes. The plane itself was salvaged from the shallows and brought ashore, a battered relic of survival. Tourists came to gaze upon it, touching the dents where wings had struck, staring at the cracked windows that had withstood the fury of the sky. For some, it was a symbol of human resilience, for others a reminder of fragility. To Marcus, it was both. He stood beside it once more, his hand pressed against the scarred fuselage, and thought of how it had carried him faithfully through the storm until it could carry him no further. In the end, the official record would list the incident as an unprecedented avian strike, a tragic accident compounded by illegal smuggling. The paperwork would reduce it to categories and codes, filed away in archives for future study. But for Marcus, it was never just an accident. It was a revelation. He had looked into the eyes of a force that did not bow to man's machines, and he had seen devotion written in the sweep of wings across the sky. On a quiet evening, long after the world had moved on to new stories, Marcus stood in his backyard, gazing upward. A flock of ordinary starlings wheeled in the distance, their flight weaving patterns against the setting sun. He watched them with a reverence he had never known before, his chest tightening with emotion. They were small, fragile, nothing like the avian army that had once surrounded his aircraft, yet their unity was no less beautiful. He thought of the birds he had seen freed from their crates, their battered wings stretching at last toward freedom, and of the countless others that had sacrificed themselves in the assault to make that freedom possible. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, the evening air filling his lungs, carrying with it the faint rustle of wings from afar. The world had changed for him in those hours above the sea, changed in a way no metal or speech could ever capture. He had come to understand that the sky was not his alone to command, that every creature had its claim upon it, its right to soar, to live, to be free. And as he opened his eyes once more, Marcus Hayden, captain of the skies, whispered a silent vow to the horizon, that he would never again look at flight as mere machinery and control, but as a shared gift, a fragile bond between man and nature, one that must be honored with humility. The memory of that day, the circling flock and the cries of freedom would remain with him forever. It was not just a story of survival. It was a lesson, carved in sky and sea, that the world could not afford to forget. If you enjoyed this incredible story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next shocking events we uncover. Trust me, the stories coming up will leave you speechless. Click here to watch our next video. It's even more unbelievable than this one. And don't forget to explore our other videos, each filled with twists you won't see coming. Finally, share this video with your friends and family. Let them experience the same jaw-dropping moment you just did. The more